Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into some really fascinating material today. Indigenous land rights, you sent over some incredible research on court decisions and historical perspectives in both the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah?
It looks like, mainly from the 1970s to the 1990s.
Yeah.
And, we talk about progress with land rights, but what does progress actually look like? It's not always a straight line, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, it really is a winding road. We often celebrate legal victories as clear wins,
Right.
but they don't always tell the whole story. Like when you look closer at these cases, you see this kind of push and pull, this tension between recognizing Indigenous rights and these really deep historical injustices.
Oh, absolutely. So, okay, let's set the stage here. What was the backdrop in the U.S. and Canada during this time? What made this period so pivotal for Indigenous land rights?
Well, both countries were wrestling with, the legacies of colonization, the displacement of indigenous populations. You had this growing movement for self-determination,
Right.
demanding recognition of sovereignty and land rights. And then on the other side, you have governments trying to figure out how to respond, or in some cases, how to avoid responding to these demands.
Interesting.
It was a time of massive tension and change, like a real clash of perspectives.
So into this already super complex situation, we get some landmark Supreme Court decisions. Let's start with U.S. v. Wheeler in 1978. Can you break down what was at the heart of this case?
Absolutely. This case, it went way beyond just one man. It gets to the core of tribal sovereignty.
Yeah.
So Anthony Robert Wheeler, he was a Navajo tribal member,
Okay.
and he was prosecuted for the same crime by both the Navajo Nation and the federal government.
Oh, wow.
He claimed double jeopardy, arguing he couldn't be tried twice for the same offense. In this case, it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court,
Wow.
and it raises this fundamental question. How much authority do tribes really have?
That's huge. And what was the court's answer to that question?
Well, the Supreme Court, they did recognize the inherent sovereignty of Native American tribes.
But there's a but coming, isn't there?
There is. They called it unique and limited sovereignty. So they affirmed tribal authority over their internal matters,
Okay.
but they also maintained that Congress ultimately has the power to limit that sovereignty.
Okay. So a step forward, but with a ceiling. How did the Indigenous School of History view this unique and limited ruling?
Right. They saw it as a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's a victory because it acknowledges tribes as having inherent rights,
Yeah.
not rights that were granted to them by the U.S. government. But it also highlights a continuing struggle for full self-determination.
Sovereignty is so crucial. But then there's the issue of actual land, right? And I think two other cases from 1979 really drive that point home. The Sioux Nation and the Narragansett tribe.
Yeah, the Sioux case, that one's really powerful. They were awarded $100 million for the illegal seizure of the Black Hills,
Yeah.
a place of immense spiritual and cultural significance to them. But they refused the money.
That's a powerful statement. What made that refusal so impactful?
It really exposed the limitations of just the legal system in truly addressing cultural loss. The Sioux made it clear that their land wasn't for sale. No amount of money could compensate for what it meant to their people.
Right.
They demanded the return of the land itself. And that demand, it continues to this day.
And in that same year, the Narragansett tribe in Rhode Island, they actually got some of their ancestral land back.
They did, yeah. About 1,800 acres were restored to them. A significant victory, a step toward righting a historical wrong.
Right.
But it also highlights how incredibly long and difficult the process of land restitution can be. Years of legal battles for them to regain even a portion of their land.
So wins and setbacks all kind of tangled up. What did progressive historians say about these cases, like especially about the Sioux refusing the money?
Well, they connected those cases to the larger issue of economic inequality. The argument being that just offering money while maybe addressing some economic needs doesn't even begin to repair the deeper cultural losses and the systemic disadvantages that many Indigenous communities face.
Yeah, it's like a Band-Aid solution to a much, much bigger problem.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and head north to Canada. They had their own set of challenges. And there's that landmark case of Calder v. British Columbia from 1973. Can you tell us more about that one?
Sure. This case, brought by the Nisga'a Nation, was all about their claim of Aboriginal title to their traditional lands in British Columbia. And Aboriginal title in Canada is interesting. It recognizes this inherent Indigenous right to land based on their long-standing occupation and use, like way before European arrival. And the Supreme Court, while they didn't grant the Nisga'a a complete victory, they did make a monumental decision.
Okay, I'm sensing another but coming here.
There is a but, yeah. But this one, it really cracked open the door to future progress. It was the very first time that Aboriginal title was acknowledged in Canadian law. The court acknowledged the Nisga's connection to their land from time immemorial, and they had massive implications for future land claims.
So not a total win, but a huge crack in the system. What happened after that? What were the ripple effects?
Well, it led to the creation of the Office of Native Claims in Canada,
Okay.
which was meant to address Indigenous land claims in a more systematic way. But even bigger than that, Calder paved the way for future land negotiations, like the Nisga'a Treaty of 1999,
Right.
where they finally got ownership of a big chunk of their traditional territory.
That's amazing. A long time coming, but a pretty remarkable outcome. How did the Consensus School of History view this shift in Canada's legal landscape?
Well, they saw the Calder case as a turning point, a sign that the Canadian government was at least starting to move toward more inclusive policies, a more inclusive legal framework.
Uh-huh.
They recognized it was a long road ahead, but they saw this recognition of Aboriginal title as a very positive step towards reconciliation and greater respect for Indigenous rights.
But progress doesn't always translate to immediate change, does it? It feels like there's always this lingering frustration.
Yeah, and a good example of that is another Canadian case with the Inuit and Cree in northern Quebec.
Okay, tell me about that.
So in the 1980s, they received financial compensation for their land, which seems like a win, but then they continued to experience really high poverty rates. It just showed how just offering money doesn't magically erase those deeply rooted problems caused by historical injustices and systemic inequalities.
Right. That gap between legal recognition and actual improvements in people's lives. What did the revisionist historians have to say about all this?
Well, they're much more critical. They see these situations as evidence that there's still resistance to real change. They argue that the very slow pace of land claim settlements and the continued hardship in a lot of Indigenous communities, it points to a pattern of systemic marginalization.
So for them, it's not just about individual cases, it's about the system itself.
Exactly. They point to the complexities, the barriers built into the land claim process itself, arguing that those barriers are actually what keeps that cycle of disadvantage going.
One last case to squeeze in before we wrap up this part of our deep dive. The Marshall decision from 1999. Now, this one caused a bit of a stir, didn't it?
Yeah, it really did. It started with Donald Marshall Jr., a Micmac man, being arrested for fishing eels out of season. His defense, it was based on 18th century treaties that granted the Micmac fishing rights.
Wait, centuries-old treaties coming into play in the modern legal system? That's incredible. So what happened?
Well, the Supreme Court, in a landmark ruling, sided with Marshall. They affirmed his treaty rights to fish and make a moderate livelihood.
Okay.
This decision was a huge victory for treaty rights, a testament to the enduring power of those historical agreements.
Okay.
But, as we've seen, there's often a but in these stories.
Oh no, here comes that but again, right?
Yeah, the but this time was that the government didn't give very clear guidelines on how to actually implement this whole moderate livelihood part of the ruling.
Oh, I see.
And it led to tensions with non-native fishermen. There were protests, even violence, as different groups were trying to figure out what this decision actually meant in practice.
It's a reminder that even when there's a legal win, the real-world impact can be so messy, so complicated. What did the Environmental School of History have to say about the Marshall decision?
For them, the Marshall decision highlighted the really crucial link between Indigenous resource rights and environmental management. It brought attention to the importance of traditional ecological knowledge, which was developed over generations of, living in close relationship with nature.
It's not just about who owns the land, but how it's taken care of, right?
Exactly. The Marshall decision really started a conversation about the vital role that Indigenous communities play in preserving ecosystems, managing resources sustainably. It emphasized how important their voices and knowledge are in any conversations about conservation and environmental protection.
It's amazing to see how these cases, they're not just isolated events, they're all threads in this intricate tapestry of law, history, and culture. And it makes me realize just how much more there is to learn about Indigenous land rights.
I agree. Each case just reveals another layer of complexity. It invites us to go deeper into this ongoing story of Indigenous communities fighting for recognition, justice, and self-determination.
We've covered so much ground just with these few cases, and it's clear this is a journey, not a destination. So what does this all mean for our listener who's been diving deep into this material with us? What are the key takeaways they should be thinking about?
Well, maybe we should take a quick break and come back to unpack those different historical perspectives a bit more.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. We'll be right back after a short break.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before the break, we were really digging into those pivotal court cases and those aha moments where it's like, oh, progress isn't always as straightforward as we think it is.
Right. And we were starting to talk about those different historical lenses, too, the schools of thought that really help us make sense of these legal battles in a broader context.
Right. And it's like we've got these 4 different sets of glasses that we're putting on
To look at this issue: Indigenous, progressive, revisionist, and environmental. Each one offering a unique perspective.
It's true. It's like looking at the same really complex issue, but seeing different facets of it.
I like that analogy. So let's start with the Indigenous School of History. What are they saying? What are the key takeaways from these cases for them?
Well, for them, I think it really boils down to self-determination. It's about reclaiming that control,
Right.
asserting inherent rights that were never surrendered, rights that exist regardless of whether any colonial power recognizes them.
So cases like U.S. v. Wheeler and Calder v. British Columbia, even with those limitations we talked about, are still seen as victories.
Absolutely. They're pushing back against that narrative
Right.
that Indigenous rights are somehow granted by colonial governments. They're affirmations of something that has always been true. Indigenous peoples have their own ways of governing their own legal systems and a connection to their lands that predates colonization.
It's about taking back a narrative that was stolen. Now, the progressive historians, they seem to approach things a bit differently, a bit more, cautious.
Maybe cautious isn't quite the right word.
Okay.
I'd say they're really focused on the realities on the ground. How are these legal decisions impacting the day-to-day lives of Indigenous people?
Right.
They acknowledge the wins, but they're also very aware of the social and economic challenges that are still there.
Yeah, so they're asking, okay, you won in court, but what did that actually change for the community?
Exactly. It's about tangible change. And cases like the Inuit Cree in northern Quebec really illustrate that point. They received financial settlements, but they continued to face systemic poverty.
Right.
And it shows that simply throwing money at a problem doesn't actually fix it.
They're looking beyond those pronouncements and asking, what does progress really look like in terms of education, healthcare, economic opportunities, and can the legal system even address those things?
I think those are exactly the questions that they're wrestling with. Now, the Revisionist School of History, they take kind of a bolder stance, a more critical one. They're not just looking at specific cases, they're looking at the entire system.
So for them, it's less about legal battles and more about a pattern of injustice that's built into the system itself.
Yes. They're asking questions like, why is the process of land claim so complex and so drawn out? Why are oral histories and traditions often dismissed as evidence? Why was there so much confusion and tension after the Marshall decision?
They're really pushing us to look deeper, to ask whether the system is actually designed to protect Indigenous rights or to hinder them.
Right. And they see those barriers, those challenges, as evidence of a deliberate attempt to limit Indigenous sovereignty, a real resistance to reconciliation. And they use historical evidence, documents, policies to support their claims.
Okay, so it's a more provocative perspective for sure. It makes you question some assumptions about progress. Now, what about the Environmental School of History? Where do they fit in?
They bring a really interesting perspective to this. They focus on that connection between Indigenous land rights and environmental stewardship.
Yeah.
And for them, cases like the Marshall decision, they really highlight the importance of traditional ecological knowledge.
Yeah.
The idea that for a lot of Indigenous communities, their relationship with the land isn't just about ownership. It's about responsibility.
Right.
It's about understanding how to live in balance with nature.
Exactly.
And that understanding of ecosystems, of sustainable practices, it's been developed over centuries. It's not just vital for Indigenous communities, it's vital for the planet.
It's realizing that a lot of Indigenous communities are the ones on the front lines of environmental protection.
Yeah.
Fighting to protect their lands and waters from being exploited and degraded.
Absolutely. The Environmental School of History sees that connection between Indigenous land rights and the fight for a healthier planet. They're saying that Indigenous communities are often the best stewards of their traditional territories.
Wow, it's fascinating how each one of these schools of thought brings something new to the table. It adds another layer to those legal battles. It's not about one being right or wrong. It's about appreciating those different viewpoints,
I agree.
the complexity of the issue.
They're all pieces of this much bigger puzzle, and together they give us a much richer and more nuanced picture of the fight for Indigenous land rights.
And it's a fight that's far from over.
Definitely not.
So what does this all mean for our listeners, for folks who've been absorbing all this material with us? What are some of the key takeaways here?
Well, I think one thing we really have to do is move past those simplistic understandings and really grapple with the nuances of Indigenous land rights. There's no quick fix.
Right.
There's no one-size-fits-all solution. It's about engaging with all the complexities of history, understanding the diversity of Indigenous perspectives, and acknowledging the ongoing challenges.
It's about recognizing that these aren't just issues of the past, they're very much alive in the present.
Yeah.
What else? What else should our listeners be thinking about?
Well, the fight for Indigenous land rights is far from over. There are land claims that haven't been settled, treaties that are still being ignored, really deep inequalities that need to be addressed.
And those legal victories, while important, they're often just the beginning of a much longer process.
Yeah.
What can people do to be part of that journey, to move beyond just understanding these issues to actually contributing to positive change?
I think the most important thing is to listen to Indigenous voices,
Mm-hmm.
learn from them. They are the people who have been most impacted by these issues, and they have incredibly valuable knowledge and wisdom. We need that to create a more just and equitable future.
It's about amplifying those voices, creating space for them to be heard, not trying to speak for them.
Exactly. We need to be allies, not saviors. Supporting Indigenous-led initiatives, working in partnership with Indigenous communities to find solutions that are sustainable and respectful,
Yeah.
that's where real change is going to come from.
So where does this leave us? What can folks do with all this information they've taken in? It can feel overwhelming at times, can it?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's normal to feel that way. But the key thing to remember is that awareness is that first step. Stay engaged, keep learning, keep asking those questions, and keep pushing for change.
What are some practical things our listeners can do? Like, what can they do to make a difference?
Well, you can support organizations that are working on these issues, advocate for policies that uphold Indigenous rights, and challenge those narratives that perpetuate harmful stereotypes.
It's about taking all this knowledge we've been talking about
Right.
and turning it into action, however big or small that might be.
Exactly. Whether it's learning more yourself, talking with your family and friends, or supporting Indigenous-led organizations, there are so many ways to get involved and make a difference.
It's interesting. I'm feeling this mix of emotions right now, kind of overwhelmed by the complexity of it all, but also really inspired by the resilience and determination of Indigenous communities.
I think that's a really natural response. And it reminds us that history isn't just something that's in the past.
Right.
It's something we're all a part of. We all have a role to play in shaping the future.
And with that, I think we'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. If legal battles are just one part of this larger struggle for Indigenous rights, what other avenues for change exist? How can we move beyond the courtroom and create a world where Indigenous knowledge, cultures, and sovereignty are truly valued and respected? That's something to keep exploring.
I agree.
Until next time, happy diving. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been on this incredible journey together, exploring these really important court cases and all the different ways of looking at the fight for Indigenous land rights.
Yeah, and it really is a journey. It's not over.
Yeah.
These legal battles, these different interpretations, they have real-world impacts that are shaping the present, and they'll definitely continue to impact the future too.
It's not just about understanding the past, right? It's about what we do with that knowledge moving forward.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of those key takeaways you think our listeners should really be taking with them?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that we need to move past those really simple understandings and really grapple with the nuances of Indigenous land rights.
Yeah.
There's no easy fix,
Right.
no magic solution. It's about really understanding the complexities of history, appreciating the diversity of Indigenous perspectives and acknowledging those ongoing challenges.
It's recognizing that these aren't just issues that are stuck in the past.
Yeah.
They're very much alive and present today.
Yeah.
What else? What else should folks be thinking about?
Well, the fight for Indigenous land rights definitely isn't over.
Mm-hmm.
There are still land claims that haven't been settled, treaties that haven't been honored,
Right.
and all those deeply ingrained inequalities that still need to be addressed.
Those legal victories we talked about, while important, they're often just the first step in a much longer process. So what can people do? How can they be a part of that journey? Not just understand these issues, but actually contribute to positive change.
That's a great question. I think the most important thing is to listen to Indigenous voices.
Yeah.
Learn from them. They're the ones who've been most affected by these issues, right? And they have so much knowledge and wisdom that we need to really create a more just and equitable future.
It's about amplifying their voices and making space for them to be heard, not speaking for them.
Exactly. We need to be allies, not saviors. Supporting Indigenous-led initiatives, working in genuine partnership with Indigenous communities to find solutions that are sustainable and respectful of their rights.
Right.
That's how real change happens.
So where do we go from here? What can people do with all this information they've been taking in? It's a lot. It can be pretty overwhelming at times, can't it?
Oh, for sure. It's a lot to process. I think it's completely understandable to feel overwhelmed. But remember, awareness, that's the first step. Stay engaged with these issues. Keep learning. Keep asking those questions.
Yeah.
And keep pushing for change.
So practically speaking, what can our listeners do to actually make a difference?
You can support organizations that are working on these issues. Advocate for policies that uphold Indigenous rights. Challenge those narratives that perpetuate harmful stereotypes.
So it's about taking all this knowledge and turning it into action, however big or small that action might be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whether it's learning more yourself, having conversations with family and friends, or supporting Indigenous-led organizations, there are so many ways to get involved and make a difference.
This has been a really powerful conversation. I have to say, I'm feeling a mix of emotions right now. Kind of overwhelmed by the complexity of it all,
I get it.
but also really inspired by the resilience and determination of Indigenous communities to keep fighting.
Yeah, I think that's a very natural response.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that history isn't just this thing that happened in the past, right?
Right.
It's something that we're all a part of, and we all have a role to play in shaping the future.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think we'll leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. If these legal battles are really just one piece of this larger puzzle, this fight for Indigenous rights, what other avenues for change are out there? How can we move beyond just the courtroom and create a world where Indigenous knowledge, cultures, and sovereignty are truly valued and respected? It's something to keep thinking about, keep learning about, and keep working towards. And until next time, happy diving!
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.